Part 4 of Federalist 53, we'll start at paragraph 7. A branch of knowledge which belongs to the acquirements of a federal representative and which has not been mentioned is that of foreign affairs. In regulating our own commerce, he ought to be not only acquainted with the treaties between the United States and other nations, but also with the commercial policy and the laws of other nations. He ought not to be altogether ignorant of the laws of nations, of the law of nations. Ignorant doesn't mean in the sense that we use it now. You have a pejorative, negative meaning to it now, which means not knowledgeable about the international law. Ignorant of the laws of law of nations. For that, as far as it is a proper object of municipal legislation, is submitted to the federal government. And although the House of Representatives is not immediately to participate in foreign negotiations and arrangements, yet from the necessary connection between the several branches of public affairs, those particular branches will frequently deserve attention in the ordinary course of legislation and will sometimes demand particular legislative sanction and cooperation. Some portion of this knowledge may, no doubt, be acquired in a man's closet, but some of it also can only be derived from the public sources of information, and all of it will be acquired to best effect by a practical attention to the subject during the period of actual service in the legislature. So, the House of Representatives, their members, another reason we want them to serve longer is because they got to be familiar not only with laws of different states, but with international law, become familiar with what's going on in other countries, because of all the commerce and dealings we'll be doing with them. He says we know, even though most of the stuff that have to do with foreign affairs is going to be in the hands of the Senate, or more directly, the Senate will be more involved, because the Senate has to give consent to treaties. The Senate does a lot of these important things that have to do with foreign affairs. But he says because these different branches are intertwined, they'll be working together towards different things, they've got to be knowledgeable enough. Otherwise, the system will not work. The next paragraph says, a few of the, and he says another thing, he says, true, some of this stuff can be learned even in your house, inside your library, different places. But he says some of these other stuff, you have to be in the legislature to see what's going on, and other details will come to you. You will accumulate all this other knowledge. That's why a 2-year term would be advantageous. A few of the members, as happens in all such assemblies, will possess superior talents, will by frequent re-elections become members of long standing, will be thoroughly masters of the public business, and perhaps not unwilling to avail themselves to those advantages. The greater proportion of new members and the less information of the bulk of the members, the more apt will they be to fall into the snares that may be laid for them. So another thing is, if you don't have enough information when you go to the House of Representatives, you can easily be tricked, whether by other countries, by the laws, by the regulations they put in place, and you can't decide on making policies that would be to the long term interest of your country. So it's good to have the practical knowledge and the practical knowledge comes when you're actually in there serving for that time. This remark is no less applicable to the relation which will subsist between the House of Representatives and the Senate. This is the last, well, it's 2 more paragraphs. This is the next one. It is an inconvenience mingled with the advantages of our frequent elections, even in a single state where they are large and hold but one legislative session in a year. That spurious election cannot be investigated and annulled in time for the decision to have its due effect. If a return can be obtained, no matter by what unlawful means, the irregular member who takes his seat, of course, is sure of holding it a sufficient time to answer his purposes. So, another thing is, he says, in this large country, if we only have the members serve for 1 year, in case they trick or with the help of others, they somehow illegally, through electoral manipulations or by fraud, they get in the office in that 1 year before we find out what has happened, before there's a recount, before there's actually finding out what has happened in that 1 year or in that one session. Because sometimes they get elected for a year, but maybe they only meet 2 or 3 months out of that year. He says he might already do the damage before we realize what's happened. So he says this is another advantage of having a longer term, to be able to, once found out, we can actually stop the damage from hurting the whole country. Hence, a very pernicious encouragement is given to the use of unlawful means for obtaining irregular returns. Were elections for the federal legislature to be annual, this practice might become a very serious abuse, particularly in the more distant states. Each house is, as it necessarily must be, the judge of the elections, qualifications, and returns of its members. And whatever improvements may be suggested by experience for simplifying and accelerating the process in disputed cases, so great a portion of a year would unavoidably elapse before an illegitimate member could be dispossessed of his seat, that the prospect of such an event would be little check to unfair and illicit means of obtaining a seat. Just like I said, might be a legitimate way of getting in the office, and before we can find out what has happened, this is when they serve only 2-3 months in a 1 year election cycle. The damage is already done. All these considerations taken together warrant us in affirming that biennial elections will be as useful to the affairs of the public as we have seen that they will be safe to the liberties of people. So elections every 2 years for the members of the House of Representatives seems to be the wisest way to go forward.